Good evening, my restless traveler of time. Tonight, we will descend, not into the palaces of kings or the battlefields of glory, but into something far more intimate. Something closer to the skin, closer to shame, closer to the parts of history that don't make it into textbooks because they stink, because they stain, because they're soaked in something more human than heroism. And that, precisely, is why they matter. So I invite you to sit with me, not to marvel at ancient beauty, but to squirm a little in your seat. Let your mind dim like candlelight, your expectations fade like parchment under time, and we, LL, begin our journey, not into war or wealth, but into the world between women as legs in a time when decency was a word used more often to judge than to help. We're going to talk about periods. No, not the kind that end a sentence. The kind that began a woman's suffering month after month, year after year, when the world had no intention of making room for her pain. And in medieval Europe, the pain wasn't just the blood. It was the filth, the neglect, the rot dressed up as routine. It was a society so eager to suppress the body that it let it fester in silence. And medieval women? They endured it anyway. In castles and in thatched huts, with nobility, or with lice. There is no poetry in bleeding through wool. There is no romance in reusing the same cloth pad for 5 days, because you only own 2, and water is cold, and the church says suffering is holy. But there is truth here. There is grit. And maybe, if we're brave enough to look close, there's something oddly liberating in seeing just how much these women endured in the shadows. Not because they were weak, but because they were told to stay clean without being given anything clean to use. Close your eyes, if you like. Imagine a stone cottage, damp and close. The floor is earth, packed by footfall. A chicken somewhere underfoot. The smell stale hay, meat that's been salted too long, and something sourer. You know it, though you don't want to. That heavy, metallic tongue, like rust in wet wool, and skin that hasn't been washed in weeks. She is sitting there, maybe spinning, maybe nursing, maybe just waiting. And beneath her skirts is a piece of cloth, folded, soaked, reused, and reused again. Perhaps she hides it from her daughters. Perhaps she learned the same hiding from her mother. This isn't the Middle Ages of stained glass and glorious battles. This is the Middle Ages of bloodstains and mildew, where bodily cycles were something to be born, not acknowledged. The female body, to the medieval mind, was already sinful. Bleeding made it worse. And so they wrapped it, not in linen, but in shame. It is easy to forget just how deeply shame was sewn into the hem of every woman's life. Menstruation wasn't just taboo, it was dangerous. The church fathers wrote about it like a curse, something that polluted altars. Something that turned wine sour and crops barren, as if a few ounces of blood could undo the very order of nature. And so, in fear, they covered it. And so, in silence, women bled. But here's the thing. Blood doesn't stop just because you pretend it is not there. It soaks, it leaks. It clots and stains and smells. And so these women had to deal with it, even when no one else would. No tampons, no sanitary pads, no clean water on demand, just whatever cloth they could spare off and repurposed from old garments, torn into strips and folded into rectangles. They called them rags. And that's where we get the phrase, on the rag, a flippant term with a brutal origin. Because to be on the rag meant precisely that, bleeding into a reused cloth in a world that treated your body like a nuisance. And you didn't change that cloth every few hours like we do now. No, you couldn't, because maybe you only had 1 or 2. Because washing it was an ordeal. Because soap was a luxury, and hot water was a labor. And so you wore it. All day, into the night. Maybe you rinsed it in a bucket and dried it near the fire, but only if you had privacy, which most didn't. And so you folded it again, layered it, sat on it, prayed it wouldn't show, prayed harder, it wouldn't smell. But it did. It's hard to describe the smell of old blood mixed with sweat, with unwashed skin, with fabric that's seen too many cycles. But it's not something you forget. Not once it's in your nostrils. And imagine living with that every month. Not for a day or two. For 5. For 7. Sitting in it, sleeping in it. Tending goats or kings in it. No matter if you were a peasant girl or a duchess, the blood didn't care. It came anyway. And yet somehow, it was supposed to be your fault that you bled, that you smelled, that your body dared to be visible in a world that wanted women invisible, unless they were pure and silent and clean. But how could you be clean when the tools for cleanliness didn't exist? When water froze in the pail, and soap was lye and ashes, and your only cloth was threadbare? So what did they do? They endured. That's the word that echoes over and over like footsteps on old stone. They endured the scraping, the chafing, the itching, the stares when a bloodstain seeped through, the lectures from priests about impurity, the whispers of other women, half in sympathy, half in disgust, because shame is contagious when no one knows where to put it. And some women, desperate, resorted to herbs, yarrow, mugwort, and pennyroyal plucked from muddy gardens, steeped into teas, or stuffed into cloths, meant to ease the flow or bring it early, or stop it altogether. Risky remedies, dangerous knowledge. But when your world tells you your body is unclean, you'll try anything to silence it. Still, the blood came, and the cloths filled. And if you lived with other women mothers, daughters, sisters, you might share. You might pass down the same blood-stained rags, washed in the same bucket, dried in the same smoke-choked hearth. Hygiene wasn't personal. It was communal. And sometimes that meant one pad, reused for several days, shared among several cycles. Do you feel the itch of it yet? The weight? Because we're just getting started. Tonight, we will walk alongside these women, not the queens in portraits, but the real ones. The ones whose lives were measured in chores and cramps, and the quiet, unrelenting work of keeping their bodies hidden from a world that pretended not to know they existed. We'll follow their scent, not perfume, but the musk of toil, and listen to their silence, which speaks louder than any sermon. You may find yourself recoiling. You may find yourself grieving. But if you stay with me, I promise, you'll understand something most history forgets. Because this story, this bloody, stained, uncomfortable story, is not just about disgust. It's about survival. And the truth is, sometimes survival is not clean. It's not noble. It's not glorious. It's just what you do, day after day, month after month, with a body the world taught you to hide. And in that quiet endurance, there is more power than any sword could offer. So sit with me a while longer. The candles are still burning. The women are waiting. And we're about to enter their world, not the way it was painted, but the way it was lived, cloth by cloth, stain by stain, one pad, several days, over and over again. Because history, when you look close enough, bleeds. You see, the story doesn't start with blood. It starts with cloth. And not the kind that makes dresses or curtains or flags. No, this cloth was rougher, humbler, always second-hand. Torn from worn-out shifts or stolen from a child's outgrown tunic, this cloth became a woman's shield against shame. Not because it worked well, but because it was all there was. And maybe it wasn't even cloth at first. Maybe it was moss, or straw, or rabbit fur, or the insides of an old glove, folded over and preyed upon. Because when the bleeding came, and it always came, the world never stopped to ask if she was ready. It just dripped its way into her life, and she had to figure it out. Imagine being 12 years old, not a woman yet, not really a child. One day, you wake up wet between your thighs, sticky and afraid. And the other girls look at you like they've seen a ghost, not because you recursed, but because now you share it. The red, the secrecy. The need to figure out how to keep walking when your legs tremble, how to keep milking cows or grinding grain while your insides twist like they trying to crawl out. And the worst part isn't even the pain. It's the silence. No one tells you what to do. Your mother might hand you a strip of cloth, her eyes heavy with things she cannot say, but there is no ceremony, no welcome. Only a quiet expectation that you'll figure it out and not bleed on the benches. And so begins the long dance with fabric. You fold it once, twice hold it against yourself, and tie it with a belt, or tuck it into underthings that don't fit quite right. There is no elastic, no adhesive, just faith, and friction, and fear. You sit carefully. You walk carefully. You don't laugh too hard, and you pray to every saint you know that this time, this month, you'll get through the worst of it without leaving a mark. Because one stain on your skirt isn't just a stain, it's an accusation. It says you failed to contain yourself, that you've let the woman in you leak out where others might see. And what then? What happens when you do stain? If you're lucky, you have a shawl. You wrap it around your waist and keep your eyes low. If you're unlucky, someone laughs. A brother, a boy, a merchant, a son who now sees you as less than, though he never had to worry about bleeding through his breeches while stacking firewood or kneeling to scrub the floor. If you're a servant, maybe you get whipped. If you're a lady, maybe you get scolded in hushed tones and sent to your chamber until you can compose yourself. Either way, you remember the shame. It becomes part of the rhythm. But the cloth doesn't care about your shame. It fills anyway. Slowly at first, then faster as the second day sets in, the heaviest, the most ruinous. You wring it out if you can, into a chamber pot, behind a tree, into straw that will soon be burned. And then you do the thing no one wants to talk about. You reuse it, because there is no other choice. The cloth is soaked, and there's no clean one waiting, so you rinse it maybe. Not with soap, there is none. Not with warm water. You have to fetch that from a well, or heat it with wood that is already scarce. So maybe you just squeeze it, flap it in the air, and stuff it back in. Because what else is there? And it chafes. God, it chafes. The rough edges rub your skin raw. You walk like you've been riding a horse for days, legs bowed, thighs burning. And you bleed into that cloth not for one day, but 3, 4, 5, changing it only when you must. Only when it begins to smell in a way you can't hide. And by then, it's not just blood. It's rot, bacteria, discomfort turned infection. And still, you keep going. You stir porridge, you carry buckets, you comb lice from your daughter's hair. You do it all while bleeding. Let's talk about the smell. Not because it's sensational, but because it's real. Blood has a scent, metallic and earthy, and when it sits in fabric for days, mixed with sweat and skin and time, it ferments. Not in the lovely way wine does, but in the way meat does when left too long in the sun. And that smell follows you. It clings to your skirts. It curls up from beneath you when you squat. You try to mask it with herbs, tuck lavender in your bodice, chew mint leaves, but it's still there. And it tells the world something you were taught to hide, that you are a woman, and you are bleeding. Some tried to fight it. Some girls folded their cloths tighter, bound themselves with string, sat for hours to avoid movement that might cause a leak. Others used more primitive methods, wool soaked in vinegar, bark softened and wrapped in linen, anything to slow the flood. But nothing truly worked. Not against a body determined to empty itself. Not in a world that offered no safe place for that emptiness. And then there were the infections. But they didn't have names back then. No one said toxic shock or bacterial vaginosis. They just said you were cursed or sick or touched by something unclean. A fever, a stench, a sudden swelling. Maybe your belly ached so badly you couldn't stand. Maybe you died, and no one understood why. They blamed the devil. They blamed your sins. But never the pad you'd worn for 6 days, because your father drank away the money that might have bought you soap. There is something cruel about that kind of invisibility, to suffer in a way that leaves no name, no record. Historians write about wars, about taxes, about kings and crusades. But no one writes about the girl who bled herself dizzy because she had no clean cloth to press between her thighs. No one tells the story of the woman who wept into her apron because the pain wouldn't stop and the midwife said it was God's Jesus punishment for lust. But those women existed, more than kings, more than saints. They were the beating, bleeding heart of the medieval world, and we buried them in silence. If you were lucky, your mother taught you how to stitch new cloths from old dresses. You kept them hidden in a chest, folded like treasure, because they were. They were your armor. They were your dignity. And if one fell into the fire or was lost in the river, it was like losing a piece of yourself. You'd wear the same cloth for days, not because you wanted to, but because you couldn't afford to do otherwise. And when it finally fell apart, threadbare and crusted, you mourned it. In some villages, women formed quiet sisterhoods. They didn't call them that. There was no word for solidarity then. But they passed down cloths, tips, even potions. Oil this bark, they'd say. Sleep with your knees up. Soak the cloth in wine. It'll ease the pain. Little rituals born of necessity. Not always safe, not always smart, but shared. And that sharing, even in whispers, even in the dark, mattered. Because when no one else would speak for you, another woman's voice was everything. But not everyone was kind. Women judged each other too. Those who bled too much. Those who smelled. Those who stained the bench in the chapel. It was a world so starved for power that even small cruelties became a form of control. She's dirty. She's lazy. She doesn't wash. As if there was always water. As if there was always time. As if she didn't spend the whole week nursing 3 children and burying the 4th. Judgment came easier than compassion. And so the shame spread, not just through cloth, but through glances, through silence, through generations. And still, the cloth remained, a constant. Folded, stained, washed when possible, hidden always. Some women named them, not out loud, but in their minds. This one was luckier. This one fit better. This one hurt less. Small superstitions to feel less helpless. Because if you couldn't control the bleeding, maybe you could control the rag. But of course, that was a lie. The cloth wasn't protection. It was permission. To keep moving. To keep working. To keep pretending. As long as you had something to bleed into, no one had to care what was bleeding inside you. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest part. Not the blood. Not the cloth, but the pretending. Pretending you weren't in pain. Pretending you weren't disgusted by your own smell. Pretending you didn't feel your body betray you every month like clockwork, dragging you back to the same place of ache and effort and silence. Pretending that the same pad, worn for several days, didn't feel like wearing your shame as underwear. That it didn't scratch your skin or soak through your soul. But you did pretend. Because you had to. Because the bread wouldn't make itself. Because the goats wouldn't milk themselves. Because the Lord's Son didn't care if you were bleeding when he pressed himself on top of you. Because life moved, and so did you, with a soaked cloth and a clenched jaw and a prayer that next month might be easier, though it never was. And in all of that, the cloth, the blood, the silence, was a kind of brutal magic. A resilience so deep it went unnoticed. These women didn't have the words for what they endured. They didn't call it trauma or oppression or systemic neglect. They just called it life. And they lived it, fully, brutally, repeatedly, with the same pad, for several days, month after month, year after year, until they stopped bleeding or stopped breathing, whichever came first. And now, centuries later, we sit in warm rooms with scented soaps and sterile wrappers, and we forget. We forget what it meant to make do, to reuse, to endure filth with no applause. But they're still with us, those women. In the silence between sentences, in the pause between cycles, in the stories no one thought to write down, because they weren't grand, only gritty. But grit is history. Grit is truth. Grit is what survives. If there is anything more invisible than the cloth, it is the woman beneath it. Not the painted lady of chivalric ballads, not the queen with jeweled hair or the temptress in brocade, but the actual woman. The one with cracked hands and a bent spine, whose name wasn't written, because parchment was too expensive to waste on the likes of her. She is the heartbeat behind every baked loaf, every mended tunic, every warmed cradle. And she bled, just like the rest. And yet somehow, she was always expected to do it quietly, cleanly, gratefully. As if the very act of bleeding were a privilege, proof of fertility, a reminder of divine design, and yet never a thing to be acknowledged aloud. Even whispering about it too plainly was indecent. And so, the woman was taught to disappear, even as her body screamed to be seen. And how does one disappear while bleeding? With practice, with habit, with a slow training of the soul to detach from discomfort. You learn to brace before you move, to clench before you laugh, to wrap yourself in layers, not just for warmth, but for concealment. You learn to read stains as warnings and smells as omens. You learn that comfort is not your birthright. That warmth, softness, freshness, those are dreams sold to men in armor or monks in velvet. Not to you, the woman with the blood. Your job is to make others comfortable while carrying a quiet war inside your own underthings. And some, in desperation, tried to find a way out. There were stories of women who turned to saints, begged at altars, even crawled through pilgrimage tunnels, hoping that if they prayed hard enough, the blood would stop. Because some thought themselves cursed, thought their heavy flow meant God was punishing them for a hidden sin, or for none at all. There were women whose bleeding never seemed to end. Not 5 days, but 20, 30. A constant trip of their own life. And there were no doctors to explain it. Only suspicion. Only the whisper of witches in wombs gone wild. And so they bled in secret, ashamed not only of their blood, but of its persistence. As if staying alive too vividly was its own kind of sin. Others went the other way. They hardened. Hardened against the shame, against the whispers, against the world that refused to meet their eyes when the blood came. These were the women who laughed when a pad leaked, who cursed aloud when the cramps hit, who bled visibly just once to show that it didn't kill them. And while the world recoiled, they survived. They stitched their cloths thicker, packed them tighter, even dared to wear red wool beneath their skirts, so no one could tell where the cloth ended and the body began. A kind of armor in reverse. Because if they couldn't be clean, they could at least be defiant. But even defiance has its limits. Try wearing the same soaked cloth through a harvest day, bending over fields with sweat dripping from your back and blood from your thighs, and tell me defiance is enough. Try sleeping beside your children, afraid to bleed on the straw mattress that has to last all winter. Try washing your rag in the village stream, while boys pretend not to stare, and then walk home with it, still wet, freezing against your skin, because the sun set too early and the firewood was used up yesterday. There is no romance here. Only the sheer, grinding reality of trying to live when the world offers no softness and commands you act as if it has. And what of the noble women, you ask? Surely they had better means. Perhaps they had finer linen, or a chambermaid to carry the bloody cloth to be boiled in secret. But privilege doesn't protect you from the architecture of shame. A lady may bleed into silk, but if her husband frowns at the smell, or the servants gossip about a stain on the bed, the humiliation cuts just the same, maybe worse. Because the higher your pedestal, the further the fall when your body dares to be real. And so even queens folded their cloths in silence. Even duchesses clutched their stomachs behind closed doors. No one escaped the biology. They just dressed it differently. And some tried to stop it altogether. There are stories, mostly lost, mostly denied, of women who used dangerous methods to delay or destroy their bleeding. Herbs that scorched the womb, poultices that burned the skin, tight binding around the belly, ice, fear. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it killed. But if you had bled for 30 years with nothing but a strip of wool between you, and the world as judgment, you too might risk a little death for a moment of peace. But peace never really came. Not for long, because the bleeding always returned. And so did the cloth. Washed or not, new or reused, always folded, always hidden. It became a kind of ritual, a prayer with no God to hear it. Fold, tuck, press, endure. Day 1 heavy, day 2 heavier. Day 3, cramps and aches and the kind of nausea that makes the world blur. Day 4, a little less. Day 5, the relief so sharp it almost hurts. And then the cloth, finally, rinsed one last time, wrung out with red fingers, hung by the hearth to dry in secret shadows, the steam rising like a ghost. And then the wait, the 3 weeks where you could pretend you were free. You danced without fear. You knelt without caution. You loved, maybe, or just breathed a little deeper, but it was never really gone. You knew it would come again, like clockwork, like punishment, like the returning tide that pulls away everything clean you tried to become. And so, you lived your life between cloths, between stains, between silences. And all the while, the men walked free, free from the blood, free from the cloth, free from the burden of timing their lives around an invisible tide. They looked at women and called them moody, unpredictable, unclean. But they never once had to walk 5 miles to fetch herbs to slow a hemorrhage. Never once had to feel the panic of blood seeping through wool while standing in mass beside a bishop. Never once had to hold their thighs together tight enough to stop a leak while begging for work at the manor gate. And this isn't about hate. It's about truth. The truth that medieval women bore not only the weight of their own bodies, but of a world too cowardly to acknowledge what those bodies did. They weren't taught how to manage it, only to endure it. They weren't given comfort, only consequences. And yet they lived. They survived. They stained the earth with their stories, though no one wrote them down. And still their ghosts linger, not in castles or graveyards, but in the quiet refusal of modern women to accept silence anymore. In every whispered "me too," in every shared pack of pads in a public bathroom, in every woman who refuses to be embarrassed when the red shows. They do not live in museums. They live in bloodlines. They live in us. And so this story does not end. It loops. It circles. Like a cycle. Like a cloth folded and refolded. A truth too long hidden. A history too long cleaned up. But we will not clean it here. We will let it sit, heavy and wet, in our hands. We will hold it up to the light, not to shame it, but to honor it. Because to bleed and survive is not disgusting. It is divine. There is something strange that happens when you live your life wrapped in silence. You start to believe it belongs to you, as if the hush was your own doing, as if the blood wasn't just leaking from between your legs, but also eroding the space where your voice used to live. That's what happened to countless women. Not that they were born voiceless, but that they were taught to offer their tongues to the fire like offerings, piece by piece, month by month, not through beatings. Not always, but through something subtler, more enduring. The grim look from a mother who caught you washing your cloth too openly. The priest's breath catching in disgust when you asked if God understood your pain. The boy who turned away, not because you were ugly, but because the blood had made you real, and real things frightened him more than sin ever could. So women bled in corners, bent over rivers and behind barns and under stairwells, not because they wanted to hide, but because they had learned the cost of being seen. They learned it early, and they learned it deep, and the cloths they used weren't just for catching blood, they were for catching shame, for absorbing every unspoken rule about what it meant to be a woman worth keeping, worth marrying, worth surviving. Because even survival had conditions. Keep quiet. Stay clean. Don't bleed where it shows. Don't smell. Don't speak of it. And above all, don't ask for more. Don't ask for clean linen if yours is torn. Don't ask for rest when the cramps fold you in half. Don't ask for kindness, for recognition, for a moment of softness. Just bleed, quietly, efficiently, out of sight. But the body doesn't care for rules. The body is wild, feral, older than churches and crowns. And so it bleeds, and it aches, and it bursts forth at the most inconvenient times, in the middle of planting season, on the morning of a wedding, in the dead of winter when water freezes before it hits the ground. Blood never waits. It has no sense of decorum. It comes when it will, and takes what it needs. And so these women, trapped in a world where nature itself was considered unclean if it flowed through a female form, did the only thing they could. They adapted. They didn't complain. Not out loud. Complaining was for those with power. They adjusted, bent their lives around the rhythm of the blood like vines around a crooked post. They planned chores according to the weight of their flow. They prepared meals hunched over so no one would see them wincing. They stuffed extra straw under their skirts if they knew they'd be standing all day. They wore extra layers not for modesty, but for protection. Against leaks, against eyes, against the world. And what about the days when even the cloth was missing? Because there were days like that. Weeks, sometimes. When the old pad had finally shredded beyond use, and the new one hadn't been stitched yet, and there was no money for linen scraps, and the baby was teething, and the firewood was low. What then? Then you bled into your skirts. You wrapped yourself in whatever was closest. Old grain sacks, bundled grass, your own hair if that's all you had. You sat on hay and stood in corners and prayed no one noticed the trail you left behind. You wiped yourself with leaves and bark and parts of your own dress. And when it dried, crusted and stiff, you walked anyway, because you had to, because no one else was going to feed your children, because the Lord's taxes wouldn't wait, because bleeding in that life wasn't a reason to stop. It was just background noise, just another layer of the mud you dragged through every day, and still no one spoke of it. Not the midwives, though they knew every shade of blood by name. Not the healers, though they brewed teas that turned wombs inside out. Not the mothers, though they passed their rags from hand to hand like heirlooms. It wasn't that they didn't know. It's that they weren't allowed to know too openly. To speak of it clearly was to acknowledge its power, and the world didn't want women remembering they had any. Because a woman who could bleed for 7 days and keep walking was dangerous. A woman who understood the cycles of her own body too well might start asking why the church feared her so much. A woman who stopped being disgusted with herself might stop accepting the disgust of others. And so they were told to pretend that this was normal, that they were lucky to bleed, that the pain was sacred, the smell a reminder of Eve's original sin. It wasn't oppression, it was virtue. But there is nothing virtuous in suffering alone. And yet they did, in every season, in every station. The lady with silk drawers that stained despite their price. The peasant who folded the same cloth so many times it disintegrated mid-cycle. The nun who bled behind stone walls while praying for forgiveness for something her body had no choice in. They all shared the same truth, even if they never said it aloud. The body bleeds, the world turns away, and in that turning away, something inside the woman breaks, not enough to kill her, just enough to keep her silent. And in that silence, a question begins to form. Not one anyone dares to ask, but one that lingers anyway. What if the blood is not the problem? What if the cloth is not the shameful thing? What if the shame itself was placed there, sewn into the hem by hands that never bled, never burned, never hid in shadow? What if the disgust is not natural, but taught? A script passed down not by necessity, but by design? That question, once formed, is hard to ignore. It festers, grows, and though most women never voiced it, some began to live it. They stopped hiding their cloths so carefully. They sat longer by the fire when they washed them. They looked their daughters in the eyes and told them it would hurt. Yes, but it wasn't wrong. They named the blood, not aloud, but in their hearts. They reclaimed it. And the cloth, that humble strip of fabric reused so many times its threads remembered every cycle, became more than a tool. It became a symbol, not of disgust, but of endurance, not of failure, but of function. A mark of continuity, of resilience, of something sacred that the world forgot how to hold. Because the cloth, reused again and again, didn't mean they were poor. It meant they were resourceful. It meant they survived in spite of the filth, not because of it. That they found a way to stay alive, stay moving, stay human in a world that gave them no room to be. And maybe that's what disgusts us truly. Not the blood, not the pad, but the mirror it holds up. The reminder of how many generations we let suffer in silence because their pain didn't befit the narrative. We praise warriors who fall in battle, but ignore women who bled monthly without rest, without thanks, without choice. We build monuments to kings and leave the midwives in unmarked graves. And yet, it was those women, soaked and silent, who built the world we stand on. So let us not turn away anymore. Let us sit with the smell, the stain, the ache. Let us honor the cloth, not as something disgusting, but as something divine in its resilience. Let us remember that the same pad, used for several days, was not a failure of hygiene. It was a triumph of survival. A woman, limited by everything, still finding a way to keep moving, still finding a way to bleed without breaking, still finding a way to exist in a world that forgot how to look her in the eyes. She is still with us, not in museums, not in books, but in every girl who hides a pad up her sleeve, in every woman who hesitates before standing up in white pants, in every mother who teaches her daughter how to fold the cloth, and more importantly, how not to be ashamed of needing it. They are the quiet historians. Their blood writes the stories we were too afraid to tell. But not anymore. There are things no history book teaches you, not because they're unimportant, but because they're too real, too soft, too sticky to fit between the margins. Things like how a woman learns to sit differently when she's wearing a rag that hasn't dried properly, still damp from last night's rinse. Or how she balances herself just slightly to one side so the blood doesn't soak through too fast. Or how she holds her breath when standing up after hours kneeling at the hearth, afraid of what mark she might leave behind. These things don't get carved into stone or sung in ballads, but they were learned all the same, learned early, learned without words, passed from woman to woman in glances, in subtle shifts of posture, in the way a daughter watches her mother fold her apron twice before hanging it by the door. And all of it wrapped around one silent understanding. Your body is a thing to manage, not a thing to live in. Your blood is not a source of life, but a problem to solve, a thing to hide, a burden to carry. And carry it they did, not just in cloth, but in memory, in silence, in centuries of muscle memory that never belonged to them in the first place. Because there is no comfort in the same pad, worn again and again, only the illusion of survival. You didn't keep it because it worked. You kept it because you had nothing else. You folded it tighter. You stitched it with trembling fingers by candlelight. You prayed over it. Not to saints, not always. Sometimes just to yourself. A whisper, a wish. Please, just hold a little longer. Please, don't betray me today. Please, let me get through this market trip without leaking shame all over my skirts. And the cloth, silent and soaked, gave no answers. It absorbed what it could. Then it gave way. And when it did, you bled through. Onto straw, onto stone, onto your own dignity. And still, you moved forward. Because the goats needed milking. Because your mother-in-law was watching. Because the Lord's bread wouldn't bake itself. Because the world expected you to carry yourself like a vessel of grace, even when your thighs were raw from chafing and the blood felt endless. But the worst wasn't the blood. Not always. Sometimes it was the way your own body betrayed you. The way the pain came not in waves, but in crushing floods that made you bite your lip until it bled too. The cramps that came like wolves in the night, snapping through your spine, curling you into a shape not even grief could mimic. The dizziness, the nausea, the sudden chills that made your hands shake as you stirred stew or scrubbed floors. And you couldn't cry. Not for long. Because someone would hear. Someone would ask. And there was no room for pity. So you swallowed the pain and called it patience. You called it obedience. You called it womanhood. And no one told you otherwise. There were no hot water bottles. No ibuprofen. Just bark teas that made your stomach turn, or cold claws on your forehead that did nothing but remind you how cold the world already was. And still, life pressed on, and you pressed with it, with your reused pad bunched beneath you, damp and itchy, carrying not just blood, but the weight of everything you couldn't say. And sometimes you dreamed of burning it, that one cloth, that rag that had clung to you for days. You imagined throwing it into the fire, watching the smoke rise, not as sacrifice, but as rebellion. But you never did, because you needed it. Because if you burned it, you'd have to find another. And the devil you know is safer than the one you don't, even when it scratches your skin like guilt. And somewhere along the way, the cloth began to shape you, not just your body, but your mind. You measured time by it, counted days, dreaded the red, planned chores around it. You waited for it. Sometimes, when it didn't come, you panicked. Not because you missed the blood, but because its absence meant something worse. Maybe you were with child. Maybe your body had turned on you in a new way. Maybe the bleeding would return with punishment, with fever, with clots the size of secrets. There was no peace, only different forms of waiting. Waiting for it to start, waiting for it to stop, waiting for the next cloth to dry, waiting for someone, anyone, to see what it cost to keep walking. And no one did. Not really. Not the priest, who preached of purity while averting his eyes from your laundry line. Not the husband, who grumbled when your touch cooled during your cycle, never understanding the tenderness it took just to keep your hands steady. Not the village boys, who laughed when you walked with clenched thighs or avoided sitting on the communal bench. They didn't see. They didn't want to. And so the cloth became not just your shield, but your sentence. Your silence. Your whole world compressed into a stained square of fabric that you couldn't afford to lose and couldn't bear to keep. Sometimes you talked to it, in your head, when no one else would listen. You spoke to it like a friend, a betrayer, a burden. You blamed it. You thanked it. You hated it. And in that, you began to confuse it for yourself. The pad was you. Dirty, secret, necessary, replaceable. And when it was soaked beyond saving, you wrung it out anyway. Because it had to last. Just one more day. Just one more hour. just until the fire died, or the soup finished boiling, or the baby stopped crying. Just until the blood slowed enough for you to breathe again. But breath never came easily. Not when your body was under siege. Not when the world looked at you and saw a mother, a wife, a sinner, anything but a bleeding human. And so your breath became shallow, your posture bent, your spine curved not from age, but from the constant hunch of hiding. You carried the cloth not just in your undergarments, but in your soul, folded neatly into the part of you that stopped asking for softness. And what happened when it slipped? When it moved? When it failed? When you bled through in front of your brother's friends, or on the church pew, or while lifting a sack of grain and felt the sudden warmth spread beneath you like shame incarnate. You didn't scream. You didn't cry. You didn't even run. You froze. Learned stillness as self-defense. Learned to laugh it off, or ignore the looks, or clean it later, after dark, when the others were asleep. And in that stillness, a different kind of rot grew. Not on your skin, in your heart, the slow decay of self-worth. The quiet erosion of knowing you mattered, but you did. Even when the world forgot you. Even when you forgot yourself, you mattered. And so did the cloth, not because it was clean, not because it worked, but because you made it matter. You made it enough. You turned that rag into armor, into ritual, into a form of resistance so deep and ancient, it couldn't be erased by time or doctrine or disgust. You kept bleeding, and you kept folding, and you kept walking. That is history. That is heroism. And that is what we must remember now. Not the myth of cleanliness, but the truth of survival. The irony of it all is that even when the bleeding stopped, the stain remained not on cloth, not on skirt, but somewhere deeper, in the folds of memory, in the way the body remembered being ignored, and in the way the hands that once held the cloth now curled instinctively when someone mentioned cleanliness. Because for all the months and years that a woman spent managing the blood, no one ever told her what to do with the silence that came after. No one prepared her for the way her body would still brace every 28 days out of sheer habit, long after the bleeding ceased. No one warned her that even when her last pad had been folded, rinsed, dried, and stored one final time, her soul might still bleed, quietly, without proof, without cloth. Because something happens when you spend half your life treating your body like an apology. You forget how to live in it without flinching. And that's not just biology. That's legacy. That's the inheritance passed down in every stained rag, in every hush-hush conversation, in every glance that said, "We don't talk about that here." And so, even as the blood faded, the fear did not. Nor did the learned instinct to hide, to mask, to endure. These women didn't just survive cycles. They survived the world's refusal to acknowledge them. And still, there were moments, rare, quiet, fragile, where they saw each other, really saw. Like when two women reached for the same bucket by the river, and one noticed the cloth hidden in the other's sleeve, and they shared a glance that said more than any word. Not shame, but recognition. Not disgust, but understanding. Or when a grandmother stitched a new pad for her granddaughter from the remnants of her wedding shift, not because it was tradition, but because it was survival wrapped in tenderness. And in that act, a new kind of ritual was born, one that wasn't about hiding, but about passing on something that had kept her alive. Or when a woman heard her daughter cry in the outhouse, and instead of scolding her for staining her skirts, she brought her a cup of warm water, sat beside her, and told her the truth. It hurts, yes, but you're not dirty. You're strong. You're bleeding because you can carry life, not because you're less. Those moments didn't rewrite history, but they whispered to it. And sometimes, a whisper is enough to begin again. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle hidden in this filthy, forgotten story, that despite the rot, despite the silence, despite the pad worn day after day, until its fibers gave out, the women remained. Their bodies endured what the world refused to make room for. Their minds carried secrets no scripture dared name. Their hearts kept beating even when the blood wouldn't stop. And in their kitchens and corners and churches and fields, they kept going, not out of ignorance. Not because they didn't know what they were worth, but because somewhere, deep beneath the layers of linen and judgment, they knew that to bleed and keep breathing was a rebellion all its own. And maybe they couldn't name it. Maybe they never had the language to call it resistance. But they lived it. Every time they stood up despite the pain. Every time they stitched another cloth from the hem of their only dress. Every time they held their tongue when someone muttered, "unclean." Every time they didn't. And sometimes, just sometimes, the cloth itself became a kind of scripture. Not one of words, but of wear, of texture, of persistence. It told the story of its owner's life in stains and seams. This one darker, from the winter she bled too long. That tear, from the summer she had to run to the field despite the pain. The faint blue thread, a gift from a neighbor who knew. And the edges, frayed from years of folding and unfolding, like pages of a book no one would publish, but every woman knew by heart. A book of survival. A book of refusal. A book that said, I was here. I bled. I mattered, even if the world forgot. And what of love? What of desire? Where did those things live in a body taught to hide its very fluids? What happened to the girl who kissed behind barns with blood between her legs, who feared her own scent might betray her? What of the wife who lay beneath her husband while praying he wouldn't notice the cloth, damp and warm, tucked awkwardly between them? How does one feel wanted when the world teaches that your natural state is repulsive, and yet somehow they still loved? Somehow they still craved. Somehow, in the cracks between survival, passion bloomed. Not in the way songs describe, not in roses and poetry, but in shared breath, in stolen moments of softness, in the way a lover helped rinse a pad in secret or fetched herbs to ease the pain. In those small kindnesses, a new truth grew, that a woman's body, even stained, even bleeding, was not unworthy, was not untouchable, was not unlovable, but it took years, generations perhaps, to believe that. And even now, that work is not finished. But the cloth, the same pad, the same square of stained resilience, outlasted them all. It traveled through time, not because it was glorious, but because it was necessary. And in necessity, there is power. The kind of power no king can claim. The kind that doesn't scream, but stays. The kind that says, I don't need to be seen to survive. I don't need to be praised to endure. I just need to exist, to absorb, to hold. And so it did, over and over, for days at a time, across lifetimes, until finally someone dared to look at it without turning away, dared to say, this too is history, this too is sacred, this too deserves to be remembered. Because it's not just about hygiene, not really. It's about who we decide is worthy of comfort, who we allow to be clean, who we forgive for being human. The pad was never the problem. The blood was never the crime. The silence was. The forgetting was. The pretending was. And that's why we speak it now, not to glorify the suffering, but to honor the ones who bore it. Not to shame the past, but to free the future. Because every time we tell this story, every time we unfold the cloth and hold it to the light, we remind the world that women have always been here, bleeding, surviving, writing history on rags no one thought to save. But we save it now. Sometimes I wonder what the cloth would say if it could speak. Not scream, not sob, but speak, softly, steadily, like old women do when they've outlived enough pain to see patterns in it. Maybe it wouldn't accuse. Maybe it wouldn't beg. Maybe it would only whisper, I remember. I remember the hands that held me, trembling, too young to understand what blood meant. I remember the heat of thighs pressed too tightly together in fear. I remember the nights by the fire, hung up to dry like meat, curling at the corners from overuse. I remember the shame I soaked up, so the woman wouldn't have to carry all of it in her eyes. I remember being hidden beneath beds, behind stones, buried in the corners of outhouses like guilty secrets. I remember because no one else was allowed to. And I never judged. I never asked why I was never replaced. I never cried when I was scrubbed raw against river rock. I just held on. Day after day, pad after pad, life after life. And maybe that is all a woman needed sometimes. Not pity, not permission, just something that stayed. Something that didn't flinch. Something that was already ruined, so her dignity didn't have to be. And perhaps that's why she kept me, reused me, clung to me like a relic of some unspoken holiness. Not because I was clean, but because I was loyal. Because I had seen everything and never left. Because she could fold me into silence and at least know something in her world would hold. And there's something holy about that kind of filth. Not because it's divine, but because it is the opposite of illusion. Blood-stained cloth doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend. It doesn't posture like silk or perfume. It tells the truth of the body. It says, this happened, this hurt, this passed, this remains. And that truth, in a world built on denying women the right to speak, is more revolutionary than scripture. And maybe that's why it was always hidden. Not because it was disgusting, but because it was dangerous. Because anything that speaks the truth so plainly, so irrevocably, becomes something the world must either revere or destroy. And cloth, humble, soaked, quiet, could not be revered. So they destroyed it, or tried to. They made it shameful. They made it secret. They made it invisible. But it was there. In every woman's chamber, in every peasant's barn, in every midwife's satchel, folded beside dried herbs and whispered names of lost daughters. It was there when no one else was, and it stayed, even when the women who used it didn't, because not all of them survived. Let's say that plainly. Not all women made it. Some bled too much. Some bled too long. Some folded the same rag too many times, and infection crawled up through places no one ever examined. Some screamed alone and were found with fevered skin and sheets soaked through. Mouths still open like a question no one wanted to answer. They didn't have tombstones. They didn't get eulogies. Some weren't even buried properly. Too unclean, too poor, too forgotten. They were wrapped in the same sheets they died on, carried to shallow holes, and left without ceremony. And no one spoke of them again. Because to speak of them would be to admit that this world kills quietly too. That death doesn't always arrive with swords and fire. Sometimes it wears linen and comes every 28 days until the heart gives out. And still, somehow, the world went on pretending it was the blood that was indecent, not the silence around it. That it was the pad that needed hiding, not the cruelty that made it necessary to wear the same one for so many days. That women were fragile, when in fact they endured so much that fragility rotted before it even touched them. These women weren't weak. They were carved from patience, so ancient it made stone look soft. They walked with cloth between their legs and fire in their bellies. They stitched and stirred and scrubbed while bleeding through layers of shame, and still managed to raise children, bury husbands, bake bread, survive plagues. And all without ever being given a word for what that strength really was. Because it wasn't bravery. It wasn't martyrdom. It wasn't even endurance. It was just life, unrewarded, unrecognized, unrelenting. And in the churches, they were told that Eve brought this curse upon them, that their bleeding was the price for curiosity, for wanting to know too much, for reaching for knowledge. But maybe that's the part that makes me ache the most, because the bleeding didn't make them weaker, it made them wiser. There is something about living in a body that breaks and bleeds and heals every month without asking permission, that teaches you something no book ever could. It teaches you that pain doesn't always end, but it does evolve. That the body is a battlefield and a sanctuary at once. That you can be bleeding and still be worthy of gentleness. That you can carry suffering and still create joy. That you can fold the same pad again and again and still unfold yourself into a person who matters. And maybe, just maybe, that's what those women learned in secret. That the cloth didn't only catch blood. It caught lessons. It caught memory. It caught the proof that they were real. They were here. They were alive. And not just alive, but life-giving. And though no one gave them medals, though no one carved their names into marble, the blood they shed fertilized a history we all grew from. Not the history of battles, but the history of breath, of bread, of barely making dash at dash, but making dash at dash anyway. So if we talk about disgusting hygiene, let us not forget the word disgusting was invented by the powerful to shame the real. Let us remember that disgust is a tool, a cage, a finger pointed at the truth to make it shrink. Let us ask, who decided bleeding was dirty? Who decided a pad reused was failure, not evidence of ingenuity in a world that gave women so little? Who decided that the pain of a monthly cycle was to be borne in silence, while the pain of a stubbed male toe received immediate sympathy and rest? No one decided it out loud. That would have made it too easy to confront. Instead, they wrote it into customs, into laws, into looks, into the placement of water basins, and the denial of herbs, and the mockery of anything that smelled too much like life. And so the women bore it, month after month, with cloth, with silence, with fury so old it stopped calling itself by name. But I remember. And now, you do too. If there was one place more hostile to the bleeding woman than the streets or the hearth or the field, it was the chapel. Not because God turned his face, but because man made sure he would twisting the divine into something afraid of blood of bodies of women. They said you couldn't take communion while bleeding, said you'd pollute the host with your flow, said a menstruating woman's as breath could wilt flowers, and her shadow could sour milk, and if she touched the altar cloth, it would never come clean again. And she believed them, because what else was there to believe when your own skin became a sin before you had the chance to choose it? She knelt at the edge of pews with a rag between her legs and the weight of eternal guilt in her chest, wondering how something her body did without her consent could be so offensive to a God who supposedly made her, and the irony was never lost. Not really. Not deep down, that the same church that called her womb a miracle also called it unclean the moment it dared to speak in blood. And so she prayed from afar, hands clasped over a belly that pulsed with pain, whispering verses through clenched teeth, not to be saved, but to be accepted, just once, just as she was, not as a temptation, not as a fallen daughter of Eve, not as a walking risk to sacred cloth, but as a person, a soul, a body doing exactly what it was designed to do. And if the church was the body of Christ, then where was the space for hers? They built whole theologies on her silence, called it modesty, called it reverence, told her that cleanliness was next to godliness, and then refused her access to water, refused. Her warmth refused her dignity, while she bled, then turned around and called her unworthy for the stains she could not help but wear. And when she wept, they told her to offer it up. When she questioned, they told her to confess. When she resisted, they told her to kneel lower, pray longer, ask harder for forgiveness she never should have needed. And still she returned. Every week, every Mass, every feast day, rags bundled under her skirts, thighs sticky, heart hollowed out by the distance between her body and the pulpit, and she sat there still, not because she believed she belonged, but because she had nowhere else to go. And there, in that stillness, she learned the cruelest lesson of all. that the closer she came to divinity, the further she was from being seen. So she made her own rituals, secret ones, in the garden at dusk when the men were drunk or asleep. She buried her used pads beneath lavender bushes, whispered names into the soil, not saints, not angels, but women she remembered from childhood, neighbors who died young, sisters who bled too long, and she lit candles from kitchen wax and called it prayer. She didn't know the Latin, but she knew what devotion felt like. She knew what it meant to bleed and still plant, still feed, still love. And in those moments, she redefined holiness, not as purity, but as persistence, not as silence, but as survival. She anointed her own body with rose water and mint, not to seduce, but to soothe. She made poultices from crushed herbs and lined her cloth with petals when she could afford it, not for vanity, but for dignity. Her spirituality was stitched into every reused rag, every cracked knuckle, every time she folded pain into something livable. And no priest would ever see that. No bishop would ever bless it. But it was there. A faith made not of dogma, but of doing. A faith that smelled like blood and smoke and resilience. And still, superstition hunted her down like a dog. When crops failed, they blamed the women who bled. When animals died, they whispered that someone had touched them during her time. When wine turned bitter, they searched for bloodstains on cellar floors. And all the while, these women were carrying burdens too heavy for confession. The burden of being body in a world that wanted spirit only. The burden of being cyclic in a world that prized constancy. The burden of being fluid in a theology carved in stone. And so they shrank. Not their bodies. Those bloomed whether they wanted them to or not, but their presence. They learned to take up less space in every room, to speak only when spoken to smile with lips that tasted of copper and repentance. And when they didn't, when a woman dared to speak too loudly, bleed too freely, heal too confidently, they burned her. They called it witchcraft. But what they really meant was power. Power rooted in understanding one's own body. Power in tracking the moon and seeing its reflection in your flow. Power in knowing which herb could ease pain, which bark could slow the tide, which flower could coax the bleeding forward when it stalled like a choked river. And if a woman knew those things, and if she used them, and if she spoke of them out loud, she became a threat. Not to God, but to the order built in his name. And so they watched her, branded her, bound her, lit the fires and turned their faces as if the flames weren't to consuming centuries of quiet wisdom. And the rest watched, silent, terrified, holding their blood in clenched fists, hoping their silence would keep them safe. It didn't, but they tried anyway. Because even if they hated the cloth, even if they dreamed of throwing it into the fire and never bleeding again, they still knew that cloth was the only thing between them and suspicion, between them and the stake. And when it wasn't suspicion, it was ridicule. Laughter sharpened like knives. Boys in the village throwing rags into the air like flags, mimicking the stink they imagined, calling out to girls in the square, "Is it your time? Is the devil bleeding you again?" And the girls who had walked to school with cotton-wrapped wool between their legs, who had bled through their only underdress and tied it up with reeds while the sun was still rising. They said nothing, because to answer was to admit, and to admit was to surrender. So they swallowed the laughter and sat in it, let it soak in, let it stain deeper than any blood ever could. And the men who laughed never knew what it cost to walk home that day, to strip off that dress and rinse it in silence, to wring it with hands that were still shaking, to hang it behind the chimney where no one would see, and still go to bed, and still wake up, and still do it all again tomorrow. So when people say disgusting hygiene practices, I want them to look closer, not at the cloth, not at the blood, but at the world that forced such practices to be the only option. A world that had soap, but kept it for the altar. That had cloth, but sewed it into banners for kings instead of rags for women. That had water, but gave it to the fields, while women washed their blood in rivers, thick with mud and ash. That had the means to help, but chose instead to punish, to shame, to ignore. Disgusting? Yes, but not the women. Never the women. The disgust belongs to the systems that failed them, not the bodies that survived, because they did survive. And that's the part we rarely say, that for every story buried under centuries of silence, there was a woman who refused to stop living. She wore the same pad for days, yes, but she also nursed children with cracked nipples, and cleaned wounds with her own spit, and told stories by firelight that made little girls laugh even when they were bleeding. 2. She planted onions while leaking red into the soil. She carried buckets while her lower back screamed. She smiled. She danced. She cursed. She existed. And if that isn't a miracle, then I don't know what is. The thing no one tells you is that the most painful part of bleeding in silence, I send to the blood, or the cloth, or even the shame. It has the forgetting. Not the forgetting that comes from time, but the kind that grows inside. You like mold in corners that never see sunlight, the forgetting that's taught, inherited, rehearsed, performed. Like a hymn you no longer translate, but still know by heart. It starts small, with a girl hiding her stained dress under her bed and telling herself it doesn't matter. Then it spreads. She hides the cloth. She hides the pain. She hides the fact that she sometimes cries for no reason when it comes. She hides the shaking in her knees. And the bite marks on the inside of her cheek from when she held back the spring during the third day. Cramps that felt like a punishment sent by something too big to name. And as the months pass, as the years pass, she learns to forget what it was like to expect comfort. She forgets softness. She forgets the possibility of being held without being fixed. She forgets that there were cultures before hers, far away and long gone, where bleeding wasn't a burden, but a right, a reverence, a renewal. And now, in her village with its stone streets and cold air and cold eyes, she forgets even how to want more. She doesn't just forget history, she forgets herself. Until one day she holds a cloth so old it smells like smoke from a fire burned 10 winters ago. And it finally tears in her hand, quietly, like a breath giving out. And maybe she cries then, not because of the rag, not because of the blood that's already soaking into the inside of her thighs, but because that tear feels like something deeper, like the final thread snapping in a story she's carried without ever being allowed to write it. And then something happens, something small, something nearly invisible. Maybe it's a girl, younger, watching her from the doorway. Maybe it's a daughter, or a niece, or a neighbor's child with wide eyes and curious questions, and none of the shame yet. Maybe the woman looks at her and sees the cycle begin again. The confusion, the fear, the dread. And something inside her says no. Maybe not this time. Maybe not her. And the woman goes to the chest and opens it. Not the one with the fine cloth or the heirlooms, but the one hidden behind the stove. The one where the rags live. She pulls one out, not folded, not cleaned for display, but real, stained, used. She doesn't hide it. She holds it up like a lesson. She doesn't speak in poetry. She says, "This is what we use. You'll bleed. You'll be okay. It won't feel holy. It won't feel fair. But it's not your fault. You hear me? This," and she shakes the rag a little, like a banner, like a warning, like a flag no country ever flew. "This is not shame. This is survival." And for the first time, the cloth doesn't feel heavy in her hand. It feels honest. And that moment, brief, mundane, unrecorded, is a revolution. Because to hand the truth to the next generation, without disgust, is the beginning of repair. Not just the repair of hygiene or history, but the repair of the soul. The soul that bled without being believed. The soul that folded itself small, over and over, like cloth, like a secret, like something too stained to show. That soul now, gently, carefully, begins to unfold, begins to breathe, begins to speak, and we must speak now too, because we live in the luxury of words. We live in a time where pads come wrapped in plastic, in colors, with wings, where warm water flows from taps, where we can write essays about menstruation without being dragged into the street and branded witch. And still, we hesitate to talk about it. Still we flinch when the blood shows. Still we teach girls to hide the wrappers in their sleeves, to whisper for help, to say, "I'm sick," instead of, "I'm bleeding." Still we pass on the forgetting, and the cloth, though cleaner now, still carries ghosts. Ghosts of the ones who didn't survive. Ghosts of the ones who survived too much. So let's remember them. Let's remember the woman who bled in a hut with no door, who folded her last dress into 4 layers just to catch what wouldn't stop coming. Let's remember the girl who died at 14 because no one believed her pain was real, who was told to stop exaggerating, who was buried in a gown stained darker than the earth they lowered her into. Let's remember the nun who cried in the chapel, begging a silent God to explain why her body felt like a punishment every month. Let's remember the mother who stitched rags by firelight while her own belly cramped, whispering lullabies to a daughter who would soon bleed too. Let us remember the wife who hid her stained cloth beneath a mattress for fear her husband would call her unclean and not touch her for weeks. Let's remember them not with pity, but with reverence. Let's build altars from our voices, not to mourn them, but to honor them. They weren't dirty. They weren't disgusting. They were divine. And so was their cloth. Yes, even the one used for several days. Even the one soaked through 3 times before being rinsed. Even the one that smelled like iron and ash and old bread. Because that cloth held their stories, held their choices, held the truth of what they endured and what they became because of it. And when we speak of it now, plainly, boldly, without flinching, we do not desecrate their memory. We restore it. We return the honor that history forgot to give them. We say, out loud, without apology, your pain was real. Your blood was real. Your strength was real. You mattered. You still do. And now as the fire dies low, and the world outside folds itself into the quiet hum of something almost peaceful, I wonder if a medieval woman sat beside us now, rags in hand, would she recognize this world we've built? Would she see the glossy wrappers and scented pads and whisper, "Miracle"? Or would she see that we still flinch, still hide, still teach our daughters to shrink and whisper instead, "Still"? Would she look at our clean sheets and warm showers and say, "Finally"? Or would she kneel beside our modern silence and say, "Again"? And what would we say in return, with our screens and soap and sealed plastic, when she asks if we speak of her now? Do we? Truly? Or do we still turn away? Do we still edit the past so it smells less like blood and more like roses? Do we tell the truth, not the palatable version, but the one that aches, about how long she bled alone, how long she sat in corners with damp cloth between her legs, while the world gave her candles, but not warmth, religion, but not mercy, survival, but never space? Or do we let her die again each time we erase her from the story? Each time we say cleanliness began with civilization and forget that it was built on the backs of the very women we never bathed? She wouldn't ask for much, I think. Not your pity, not your grief, just your witness. Just to be seen finally, not through the lens of horror or romanticized martyrdom, but simply as she was, tired, aching, bleeding, breathing, still folding the same cloth on the 5th day, and still whispering to herself that it would be over soon, that she could sleep without fear of waking in a puddle, that she could walk without carrying the weight of old blood between her legs. And if you offered her sympathy, she might laugh, not cruelly, but softly, like someone who has lived too long with too little softness and no longer trusts the sound of it. She might say, "You think the blood was the hardest part?" and then go quiet, eyes far away, back in the smoke and stone of a cottage where no one listened. Or maybe she'd take your hand, press a square of linen into your palm, and say, "Remember this." And you'd look down, expecting disgust, expecting dampness. But all you'd see is the echo of a life, faded, frayed, but undeniably human. Because that's what this has always been about. Not hygiene, not disgust, not even history, but humanity. The kind that bleeds and endures and goes unseen for centuries. The kind that doesn't show up in books, but holds up entire worlds. The kind that soaked into wool and moss and layers of secrecy and still dared to survive. The kind that now asks nothing from us except to be named. And so we do, with our breath, with our eyes, with the truth that stings and soothes in equal measure. So if you've made it this far, still with me here in the flickering quiet of our shared time, still holding the thread of this story like the edge of a fraying cloth, then maybe you too feel it. That heaviness that isn't just sorrow, but something older, something almost sacred. The recognition that this pain was never truly theirs alone. That some part of it has always lived in us, in our mothers, in our daughters, in our strange, inherited discomfort with being soft and strong and stained all at once. And maybe, just maybe, that ache is the beginning of something new, something honest. Because history is not a clean thing. It's not made of marble. It's made of fabric, worn thin, used long, washed in the dark, dried in silence, folded beside grief and carried forward by hands that never got the credit. And now that we hold it, now that we know, the question is not whether we feel sorry. It's whether we dare to speak, whether we dare to teach differently, whether we dare to unlearn the disgust, whether we dare to say to ourselves and to those who come after, it wasn't a shame. It was survival. It wasn't failure. It was fire. And you, woman, were the smoke that rose through it all and didn't choke. So maybe we don't need monuments. Maybe we don't need museums. Maybe what we need is to stop apologizing when we bleed. Maybe what we need is to stop whispering. Maybe we need to let our daughters see the cloth. Let them touch it. Let them smell its history. Let them learn that their bodies do not owe the world silence. Let them know the truth early, before the forgetting begins. Let them feel that blood is not filth. It is legacy. And maybe we can remember that every time we see a red stain and feel that ancient flicker of panic, maybe we can pause and think not, "I must hide this," but someone before me died to keep bleeding. Maybe every time we unwrap a fresh pad, we hold it like the offering it truly is, knowing that it was once a rare thing, a forbidden thing, a thing stitched in shame. Maybe every time we bleed, we do not curse the cycle, but thank the line of women who never got the chance to call it anything but burden. Maybe that's how we begin to heal. And if this quiet remembering has reached you, if this strange, stubborn truth has opened something in you, if some part of you, even the smallest, feels less alone, then maybe this was worth speaking. Maybe the cloth didn't soak in vain. Maybe the pain wasn't wasted. Maybe you, now, here, are the one who will finally pass down something better. And if not better, then at least honest. And if not honest, then at least not forgotten. So let us fold this story gently now, not to erase it, but to place it somewhere safe. Somewhere it can breathe, and bleed, and exist without fear. And if you'd like to sit by this fire again, to listen to more truths whispered from the shadows of history, I'd be honored to have you. You don't need to do anything loud. Just be here. Subscribe if you'd like, but only if you want to hold space for the voices that were never given one. Only if you believe that history is not just dates and kings, but rags and women and blood and breath. Thank you for listening. Truly, you've just made sure they weren't forgotten.